Hi, we continue in the story of Absalom's rebellion as we transition across the end of chapter 16 into chapter 17 as we work through this unit from 1615 to 1714. Absalom getting advice from two of David's counselors. Which one of them is a double agent and which one can he trust? Although neither of those questions seem to be an issue as we reach our scene today. So if you haven't been following this unit of 2 Samuel 15 to 18, I really encourage you to do so. Watch the introductory video where I go over a number of these things, including the style elements that we've seen, the interpretive options, and the shape. And I won't go over all those again today, but you can see we're now in this scene here, the last example in our story of Absalom, the focus on Absalom, and then the two sides will go into battle, and spoiler alert, David will remain king. So we've also been looking at how the story contains so many different characters and places, and we won't meet any new characters today. We're now at this section here where we've had Hushai and Ahithophel all introduced. We saw Ahithophel earlier. The purple ones are the ones that are on David's side, and Hushai will be here in Absalom's camp, but we already know from David and Hushai's earlier conversation that Hushai is a double agent working for David, or is he working for Yahweh? That'll be a question we'll have to look at as we go. And so as we look at the keywords, our section here, we'll note that Hushai's response, first to the negativity of his view, the negativity about Ahithophel's proposal, is in this nice tight chiasm before Hushai goes on and gives his own advice that follows after that. Perhaps that chiastic shape there is from Hushai and not from the writer and narrator, in the sense that what Hushai is doing, as many scholars have noted, is obfuscating. He's offering a lot of flowery language and a lot of maybes and possibles that sound like it's saying more than it really is, and we'll have to look at that as we go. But we'll note that the clarity of this chiasm is made obvious from the parallel between father and his men are warriors. Father is a warrior, and those with him are sons of power. And then the parallel metaphor or similes of like a bear robbed of her cubs and like a heart of a lion, both taken not explicitly, but as careful readers we know from 1 Samuel 17, when David testified that he was qualified to take on Goliath the Hittite, Goliath the Philistine, rather, not Uriah the Hittite, Goliath the Philistine, because he had fought with bears and lions. And now we'll see when we get there that it's reversed. So we're going to go right back up to here, and we'll note that what preceded, was Ahithophel's first advice, which was to lay down the gauntlet and go into your father's concubines. And that's what happens, and that's where we take it up now, with a brief narrator's intervention. And there's been very little narrative intervention throughout this, and so it's suggesting something about the perception of Ahithophel that readers should understand as we go. So let's look at verse 23 on the left side, and then we'll compare it with the translation that I've offered on the right. As Polza notes, the counsel of kings, like kingship itself, is a threat to the rule of Yahweh. And he notes down in that note further below, he suggests that there are three phases in the Deuteronomistic history, which is the scholarly way to refer to all the text from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, for learning God's ways. In 1 Samuel through 2 Samuel 6 to Sha'al, which is to ask God, and we noted throughout 1 Samuel how the name for the first king, Saul, in Hebrew Sha'al, means to ask, and it will arise right in this verse, as we'll see. Then from 2 Samuel 6 through 1 Kings 12, which is to say through the rebellion from Solomon's son Rehoboam by the northern group led by Jeroboam, which is to say Israel, through human consultation, and that's what we're seeing here. And then after that, from 1 Kings 13 through the very end, through Darash or Derish, which is seeking God, and often through so-called man of God or prophets, as we'll see. Thus, the rejection of asking in favor of human consultation parallels abandoning God in favor of human leaders, and that from Polzin, and we'll see more of that as we go. Going back to the top of my note here, as Polzin continues up above, the introduction of the king's counselor would appear to be a royal attempt to restrict the power of the prophet within the court, which has led me to ask again, where is Nathan in all this? And I asked that for two important reasons. We saw Nathan in 2 Samuel 7 make the promise attributed to Yahweh that someone from David's seed would always be on the throne of Jerusalem. And then we saw in 2 Samuel 12 when he chastised David with a little poetic allegory about a rich man, poor man, a ewe lamb, and a traveler over the Uriah business. And we don't hear from Nathan at all until the succession arises finally when Adonijah seeks to become king, and Nathan tries to warn Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, you better be alert or you're all going to die. So Nathan will appear later on the side of Solomon and Bathsheba, but where is he in the midst of all this Absalom stuff? We don't know. But we're in Absalom's court here, and there's no reason to think Absalom would be consulting Nathan. But Absalom does know that his choice between Ahithophel and Hushai means he's relying on one of David's counselors, which is to say he has no counselors of his own. And that's an important thing the text is showing us here, that he seems to have all Israel on his side, and the popular rebellion is on his side. David has all the experienced warriors and counselors, people like Joab and Nathan and others that he can call upon, including having called upon Hushai here to confound the counsel of Ahithophel. Again, or is that Yahweh's doing? We'll have to explore more. So what we hear is, now in those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the oracle of God. So all the counsel of Ahithophel was esteemed, both by David and by Absalom. Let's look at it in a little bit more literal way on the right side. Now in those days, and even that's not more literal because in those days is in the middle of the verse in Hebrew, the advice of Ahithophel advised, the advice that Ahithophel advised was as if one consulted, and this is Sha'al here, as you can see on the left side of the screen, he's Saul. The word of God, and no reason to have the oracle of God as if that's some obfuscation away from word of God. It's simply the word of God, Debar here. And the phrase Debar Elohim is only one other time in 1 Samuel, or in books of Samuel at all. We saw it earlier in 1 Samuel when Samuel told Saul, follow me to hear the word of God. Then we'll next see it in 1 Kings 12:22. Earlier in the Deuteronomistic history, it was once in Joshua and once in Judges with Ehud's deception, where he says, come with me and hear the word of God, and then he stabs the king in the belly. 22 times in the Masoretic text, in contrast with the word of Yahweh, which is more than 300 times in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, and for example in 2 Samuel 12:9. So that's the more common one. So is the text making some distinction here between the oracle or the word of Elohim and the word of Yahweh? That's not clear, but that's what we have here. Otherwise, we've seen throughout that Yahweh is the one that's consulted, that God is not referred to by Elohim throughout this. And although the NORSV has all the counsel of Ahithophel was esteemed, as many commentators note, that's not in the Masoretic text. So Alter suggests, even so was every counsel of Ahithophel, and another one suggests, thus was all of Ahithophel's advice. So you see mine on that side. But it's clear that both David and Solomon see the word of Ahithophel as the word of God. What they're not seeing is the word of God directly. They're relying on Ahithophel to be like the word of God, as if. But it's not the word of God. Ahithophel is not going to say, thus says Elohim or thus says Yahweh. They're treating it that way, even though it's not that. It's just a personal word of advice. So let's see what he has to say to him here. As my note below has, it's not clear how much time has passed after they pitched the tent and went into the concubines. Some time, plainly not much, because the rebellion's going at full speed, and David has already gone down and rested himself by the Jordan fords, and so Absalom has to get going if he wants to consolidate this victory here. As Falkeman notes below, Ahithophel speaks plainly, with no courtly style such as third-person self-reference or flattery, and we'll look at that more systematically in just a minute. So, moreover is not in the Hebrew here. It simply says, Ahithophel said to Absalom, let me choose. And I note right away that his counsel is full of first-person singulars, 7 times in these 3 verses. There's no room at all for Absalom's own actions or glory, although it doesn't seem to be the problem, because jumping down we can see the advice pleased Absalom and all the elders. So he's not displeased that it's not directly about him, but let's look at it more and then we'll see the comparison. So let me choose 12,000 men. What makes him qualified to choose 12,000 men? Not clear. Why 12,000? Not clear. Is this meant to symbolize the 1,000 from each of the 12 tribes? So we see the reference it's suggesting it's 12,000 from each tribe is only in numbers. Out of the thousands of Israel, 1,000 from each tribe, something that's echoed in the book of Revelation, as my note has below. But we hear nothing about that here. There's no sense that there are 12 tribes even. We've heard reference to people identified with tribes, but we haven't heard yet a sense of 12 tribes in the monarchy situation. So perhaps that's just a large number, not a necessarily strategic number. But he's proposing to choose 12,000 and set out and pursue David tonight. Is that really possible? We don't know what time of day it is, but even if it's first thing in the morning, how is he going to find 12,000 men and set out and pursue David that night? Not to mention, we have no reason to think that Ahithophel is a counselor and the word of God provider has any experience at leading people in battle. Neither does Absalom, for that matter. Is there anybody on Absalom's side who's an experienced warrior? If so, we've not heard of anybody yet. But he goes straight forward here. As my note below has, perhaps ironically echoing David's plan to kill Uriah while leaving the others unharmed, which is, listen to the language and we can note that. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged. But where? In Ahithophel's counselor, there's no sense that he knows where David is. David is a long way away, somewhere by the Jordan. That's a big territory. If 12,000 soldiers were marching across the desert, would you not think that David could tell when they were coming and go somewhere else and hide? But we'll have to look at the details of that when we finish looking at both their testimonies. So I'll come upon it, and he assumes that while he's weary here, Yaga'ah, only one other time in the Deuteronomistic history, and only another time in the entire Masoretic text, and discouraged here, or literally slack-handed, which is how I translated it here. So it's not necessarily that he's discouraged, it's that he's slower. He's at a weak moment there, not necessarily emotionally weak, but just tired. And throw him into a panic or a tremble here, a word used earlier for tremble. As my note has, the idea that David would panic at this is unlikely in the extreme. He's an experienced warrior. Why would he suddenly be in a panic, knowing that Absalom's army is going to come? Wouldn't he be fully prepared for this? And all the people with him will flee. Will they? What makes him think they would all flee? Notice in my note below the little ABA chiasm, so even Ahithophel has a little bit of poetic shape there with all the people fleeing and all the people coming back with the striking down in the middle. And I will strike down only the king. How he imagines he's going to isolate the king alone from all the king's own soldiers and all his own supporters, and everyone else will run away and no one will stick around, not even the famous sons of Zeruiah, who Absalom well knows have been so violent that David, at least officially, has to tell them to calm down. And then the final proposal is, I will bring all the people back to you. As a bride comes home to her husband is not in the Hebrew, it's from the Septuagint, and as Falkman notes, such a metaphor is a foreign body in Ahithophel style. As you can hear, he has nothing like that. So I'll bring all the people back to you. You seek the life of only one man. Is that true? Is that Absalom's goal here, is just to seek the death of his father? Is that what this is all about? And all the people will be at peace. In other words, he's offering the classic scapegoat principle. Kill one person and the people at peace. Sounds a lot like Caiaphas in relation to Jesus many centuries later. Falkman reads this as here speaks a sober politician, nay a wise statesman, and that may be the case, that knowing how to use the scapegoat mechanism, know how to get one person killed so all the people won't be destroyed, as Caiaphas puts it in the Gospel of John, may well be a wise statesman. And we hear that the advice pleased Absalom. As Bodmer notes, all that is seemingly needed to commence the operation is ratification or approval by Absalom, something that should be a fait accompli since Ahithophel's counsel has just been described as upright in his eyes. Utterly inexplicable, then, is the next sequence of events. Let's just look at the very beginning of that before we go on to hear Hushai's advice. So the advice here was literally the word was good in his eyes, as I have over here on the right side. Absalom and all the elders of Israel. And let's keep the elders of Israel in mind because we'll see them both later in 1911, but we'll see them a generation later when they come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and say, your father was harsh on us, and propose a deal by which they could continue to live under his rule, but it does not work out. So having heard that, Absalom calls Hushai the Archite, and that's what Bodmer is saying. Why? If Ahithophel is the one that he knows has come to his side, and Hushai is still perhaps a questionable double agent, and both David and Absalom have always heard Ahithophel's testimony or witness and advice as the word of God, why seek a second opinion? We don't know why. He simply says, let's do that, and let's hear literally what's in his mouth. And the first thing that Hushai does is say this. Well, here Hushai came to Absalom and said, this is what Ahithophel has said. Notice we don't hear it in repetition. We have to assume that he knows that he's reporting it accurately, what we heard, but we don't know that. Shall we do as he advises? If not, you tell us. And then he begins like this. Hushai said to Absalom, this time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. And I note that literally we see this on the right side. So in Absalom's statement, literally this is the word Ahithophel has worded. Shall we do his word? If not, you word. And that's obviously awkward in English, but I wanted to highlight that the noun and the verb for debar is in there 4 times. And so Hushai said to Absalom, this time the advice that Ahithophel has advised is not good here. And as Bodner notes, for the reader, the truth of Hushai's argument is much less important than much less important. What matters is the first instance that Absalom and those around him are invited to question the otherwise unassailable counsel of Ahithophel. And that is the point here. Hushai is planting a seed of a seed of concern here that Ahithophel's word may not be the word of God. And once he's planted that seed of doubt, then he can offer the argument that we'll see next time that says Ahithophel has not really taken account of what kind of man your father David is. We'll pick it up with Hushai's takedown of Ahithophel's counsel and his own advice next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.